The bright California sun beat down on Vin Diesel as he stepped out of his sleek black SUV. He was back in New York City, the concrete jungle where his dreams had first taken root. The familiar smells of street food and the endless symphony of honking cars brought back memories of his childhood, days long before he became the action movie star the world now knew. 10 minutes, Mr. Diesel, his assistant called out, checking her watch. Then we need to head to the next interview. Vin nodded but was already distracted. Something had pulled him back to his old neighborhood during this promotional tour. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe something deeper. He'd insisted on taking a detour through these streets despite his packed schedule. I just need some time alone, he told his team, adjusting his sunglasses. Wait here. Walking down the cracked sidewalk, Vin noticed how much had changed. The corner store where he bought candy as a kid was now a smartphone repair shop. The basketball court where he played for hours had been turned into a parking lot. But the bones of the neighborhood, the sturdy brick buildings, the narrow alleys, the fire escapes zigzagging up walls, remained the same. He was about to turn back when he spotted an elderly woman struggling with several grocery bags at the entrance of an old apartment building. She was small, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Something about her determined expression as she tried to manage the heavy bags while dealing with what looked like painful arthritis in her hands struck him. Let me help you with those, Vin said, approaching her. The woman looked up, startled. Oh, thank you, young man. These old hands don't work like they used to. As Vin took the bags, something familiar in her voice made him take a closer look. Behind the wrinkles and the years, he saw eyes he recognized, kind, intelligent eyes that had once looked at him with encouragement when he'd struggled with reading in school. Ms. Reynolds? He asked, hardly believing it himself. Eleanor Reynolds. The woman squinted up at him, confusion crossing her face before her eyes widened. My goodness, she whispered. Little Vincent, is that really you? Vin broke into a wide smile. It's me, Ms. Reynolds. I can't believe it's you. Well, you're certainly not little anymore, she laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. My third-grade troublemaker all grown up and helping old ladies with groceries. Vin carried her bags as they made their way slowly into the building. The entrance smelled of mildew, and several lights were burnt out in the hallway. The elevator had an out-of-order sign that looked like it had been there for months. I'm on the 4th floor, Ms. Reynolds said with a sigh. I usually take breaks on the landings. Don't worry about it, Vin said, carrying all her bags easily as they began the climb. Each floor revealed more of the building's poor condition, peeling paint, water stains on the ceiling, a persistent smell of dampness. You still teaching, Ms. Reynolds? Vin asked as they paused on the 3rd-floor landing so she could catch her breath. Oh no, dear, retired 8 years ago. 42 years of teaching was enough, she smiled, though there was something sad behind it. Public school teachers don't exactly retire to penthouses. When they finally reached her apartment, Vin was shocked by what he saw. The space was clean and organized, with books lining every available shelf, but it was tiny. A fold-out couch served as both sitting area and bed. The kitchen consisted of a mini fridge, a hot plate, and a microwave that looked older than his career. Let me put on some tea, Ms. Reynolds offered, filling a kettle. Unless you have somewhere to be. I imagine you're very busy these days. Vin pulled out his phone and quickly texted his assistant. I'm exactly where I need to be right now. I'd love some tea. As Ms. Reynolds busied herself in the kitchen corner, Vin noticed a small bulletin board covered with newspaper clippings. Moving closer, he realized they were all about him, movie premieres, interviews, charity events. In the center was a faded school photo of him at age 8, gap-toothed and smiling. You kept track of me all these years, he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Of course, she said, bringing over 2 chipped mugs of tea. You were special, Vincent. I always knew you would do something extraordinary with your life. I just didn't know it would be quite this extraordinary. A lump formed in Vin's throat as he looked around the shabby apartment again. How could this be? The woman who had first put a pencil in his hand and told him he could write his own story was living like this, while he owned mansions on 2 continents. Vin sat at Ms. Reynolds' small kitchen table, his large frame making the chair beneath him seem like it belonged in a dollhouse. His hands wrapped around the chipped mug of tea she had given him, the warmth seeping into his palms. The apartment was neat but worn, faded curtains hung at the windows, the linoleum floor was curling at the edges, and a persistent drip from the bathroom faucet created a rhythm in the background. "Sugar?" Ms. Reynolds asked, holding up a nearly empty sugar container. "No thanks," Vin replied, his eyes taking in more details of her living conditions. A pill organizer sat on the counter, sections filled with different medications. The radiator in the corner made a concerning rattling noise. The ceiling had water stains that had been carefully painted over, but the discoloration remained visible. "So," she said, lowering herself slowly into the chair across from him, wincing slightly as her joints protested. "Tell me everything. The last time I saw you, you were a scrappy kid with big dreams and a bigger heart." Vin smiled, but his mind was still processing the disconnect between the influential teacher from his memories and the elderly woman struggling before him. "There's not much to tell that you don't already know," he said, gesturing toward the bulletin board with its collection of newspaper clippings. "Looks like you've been following my career pretty closely." Ms. Reynolds laughed softly. "Well, it gives an old lady something to brag about at the senior center. That famous actor. He was in my class, you know. Couldn't sit still for 5 minutes, but boy, when he read aloud, he had such presence." Her eyes twinkled with the memory, and for a moment, Vin saw the younger Ms. Reynolds who had stood at the front of his third-grade classroom, full of energy and purpose. "You were the first person who ever told me I could be anything I wanted," Vin said quietly. "Do you remember that creative writing assignment? When all the other kids wrote about being firefighters or astronauts, I wrote about being a movie hero." "Of course I remember," she said, reaching out to pat his hand. "The other teachers thought I was crazy for encouraging such a far-fetched dream. But I saw something in you, a determination. You didn't just want to be in movies, you understood even then that stories have power." As they talked, Vin noticed Ms. Reynolds getting up several times to adjust the thermostat, though the temperature in the apartment didn't seem to change. Later, he would realize the heating system barely worked, and she was simply hoping for warmth that wouldn't come. "What about you?" he asked. 42 years of teaching, that's amazing. You must have taught thousands of kids." 2,736 to be exact, she said proudly. "I kept a list of every student. Not all of them became movie stars, of course, but each one mattered to me." She stood up and pulled an old leather-bound notebook from a shelf. Inside were pages and pages of names, organized by year and class. "This is my real life's work," she said, handling the book with reverence. "Each name is a story." Vin flipped through the pages until he found his class year. There was his name, along with a small note beside it. "Great imagination. Needs to channel his energy. Will go far if he believes in himself." Something tightened in his chest. While he had been off conquering Hollywood, building his fortune and fame, Ms. Reynolds had continued quietly shaping young lives, year after year, with little recognition and even less financial reward. "How did this happen?" he asked, gesturing around the apartment. "You dedicated your life to teaching. How are you living like this?" Ms. Reynolds sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "The system isn't kind to teachers, Vincent. My pension barely covers rent and utilities. Then there was Howard's medical bills before he passed. My husband," she explained, pointing to a faded photo of a kind-faced man on the bookshelf. "Insurance covered some, but we went through our savings. And then last year, I needed hip surgery." She unconsciously rubbed her hip as she spoke. "I'm one of the lucky ones. I have this apartment through a senior housing program. Some of my former colleagues are worse off." Vin looked down at his designer watch, which had cost more than Ms. Reynolds probably lived on for 6 months. He thought about his cars, his houses, the swimming pools he rarely used. The contrast made him feel hollow inside. "Don't look so sad," Ms. Reynolds said, misreading his expression. "I've had a good life. I got to do what I loved, teaching children to believe in themselves. And look at you. Knowing I played even a small part in your journey brings me joy every day." She reached for a cookie tin and opened it, revealing not cookies but old photographs and small mementos. "I keep the special things. Look, here's the thank you card you made me at the end of 3rd grade. You drew yourself as a superhero." Vin took the construction paper card, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. His childish handwriting read, "Thank you for believing in me. When I'm famous, I won't forget you." He looked up at his former teacher, her face lined with age, but her eyes still bright with the same kindness he remembered from childhood. "I'm sorry it took me so long to keep that promise," he said softly. The city lights twinkled below as Vin stood at his hotel room window, sleep nowhere in sight despite the late hour. His mind kept returning to the image of Ms. Reynolds in that tiny apartment, to the dripping faucet, to the medications lined up on her counter. The contrast between his luxury suite and her living conditions felt like a physical weight on his chest. He picked up his phone and scrolled through recent photos, red carpet events, fancy restaurants, his collection of sports cars. Pictures of a life that felt suddenly hollow compared to the meaningful work his teacher had done. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself, pacing the plush carpet. His bare feet sank into softness while he thought about Ms. Reynolds climbing 4 flights of stairs with her bad hip because the elevator in her building never worked. Vin grabbed a notepad from the desk and began writing the way Ms. Reynolds had taught him all those years ago. "Start with what you know," she'd always said. "Then figure out what you need to learn." What he knew, Ms. Reynolds had shaped his life and thousands of others. What he needed to learn, how to make sure she, and other teachers like her, could live with dignity. By morning, the notepad was filled with scribbles, arrows, and circles, a plan taking shape. The sky was turning pink when Vin finally fell asleep, but 3 hours later, he was up again, reaching for his phone with new purpose. "Tom," he said when his financial advisor answered, "I need to set up a trust fund immediately, and I need information about buying property in the city." His advisor's voice was cautious. "Vin, we've talked about making big financial decisions on impulse." "This isn't impulse," Vin cut in. "This is fixing something that should have been fixed a long time ago." Next, he called his publicity manager, Lisa. "Cancel my interviews today," he said. "Something more important came up." "You can't just cancel," Lisa protested. "The studio will." "The studio will understand when they hear why," Vin replied. "And if they don't, that's their problem." After hanging up, he made a list of industry friends who had the money and influence to help. People who, like him, had climbed to success from humble beginnings. People who might remember their own Ms. Reynolds. Around noon, Vin's phone rang. It was his friend Carlos, a director he'd worked with on 3 movies. "Got your message," Carlos said. "What's this urgent project that couldn't wait until I finish my coffee?" Vin told him about finding Ms. Reynolds, about the conditions she lived in despite giving her life to teaching. "Man, that hits home," Carlos said when Vin finished. "My 5th grade teacher, Mr. Garza, was the first person who ever put a camera in my hand. Last I heard, he was working as a night security guard after retirement just to afford his heart medication." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Vin said, his voice growing passionate. "These people shaped us, believed in us when nobody else did, and society just throws them away when they're done teaching." By late afternoon, Vin had spoken with 12 influential people in entertainment. 10 had committed to helping. He'd scheduled meetings with lawyers about setting up a foundation, researched teacher pension systems across the country, and looked into buying the entire apartment building where Ms. Reynolds lived just to start fixing it up. As evening approached, Vin stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his simple black t-shirt. He was going back to see Ms. Reynolds, this time with a plan. But as he rehearsed what to say, doubt crept in. Would she see his help as charity? Would it hurt her pride? Teachers like Ms. Reynolds didn't ask for handouts. They were givers, not takers. He remembered how she kept every student's name in that leather notebook. How she'd preserved his childish thank you card for decades. She hadn't done it for money or fame. She'd done it because she believed teaching was a calling. Vin's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Studio execs furious about cancelled interviews. Want to talk ASAP." He put the phone away without responding. Let them be furious. Some things mattered more than publicity schedules and movie promotions. Some debts couldn't be measured in dollars or screen time. The sun was setting as Vin left his hotel, carrying a small gift bag. Inside was a new leather notebook, the finest he could find on short notice. On the first page, he'd written, "For Ms. Reynolds, who taught me that stories have power. It's time to write a new story, one where teachers get the happy ending they deserve." He wasn't just going to help one teacher. He was going to change the story for all of them. The plan wasn't perfect yet, and he knew there would be obstacles, But Ms. Reynolds had taught him something else too. Start with what you know, then figure out the rest as you go. As his car navigated through evening traffic toward her apartment, Vin felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The pure, simple certainty that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. The next afternoon, Vin found himself standing outside a modern apartment building in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from Ms. Reynolds' current place. The real estate agent beside him handed over the keys with a smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Diesel. The condo is all yours. The paperwork will be finalized by tomorrow." Vin nodded his thanks, then walked through the bright, spacious rooms one more time. Sunlight streamed through large windows. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances. Most importantly, the bathroom had safety rails already installed, and the elevator in the building actually worked. Perfect, he murmured to himself. He had spent the morning with a team of decorators, picking out furniture that would feel comfortable to Ms. Reynolds, nothing too modern or fancy, but good quality pieces that would last. They had promised to have everything set up within 2 days. He left the condo with a sense of satisfaction but also nervousness. The easy part was buying things. The hard part would be convincing Ms. Reynolds to accept his help. An hour later, he knocked on her apartment door, holding the gift bag in one hand and a bag of fresh groceries in the other. "Vincent," Ms. Reynolds exclaimed when she opened the door. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Don't you have movie star things to do?" She was wearing the same cardigan as yesterday, but had added a small brooch, clearly making an effort for his visit. "Nothing more important than this," Vin replied, handing her the groceries. "I brought stuff for dinner. Thought maybe I could cook for you tonight." Ms. Reynolds looked surprised but pleased. "Well, that would be lovely. Though I must warn you, that stove has a mind of its own." As Vin cooked a simple pasta dish, Ms. Reynolds sat at the kitchen table, telling him stories about other students she had taught over the years. Her face lit up as she described their successes, not just the doctors or lawyers, but the kind-hearted plumber who still fixed her sink for free, the nurse who had found her calling after a school career fair, the shy boy who now ran a community garden. "Every child has a gift," she said. "The trick is helping them see it for themselves." When they sat down to eat, Vin gathered his courage. "Ms. Reynolds, I want to talk to you about something important." She must have heard the seriousness in his voice because she put down her fork and looked at him closely. "What is it?" "Yesterday, seeing where you live, how you've been struggling, it didn't sit right with me. You gave 42 years to teaching kids like me, and this is how society repays you." He gestured around the apartment. "It's not fair, and I want to change it." Ms. Reynolds' expression shifted. "Vincent, I appreciate your concern, but I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Vin said quickly. "Think of it as delayed payment for services rendered. You invested in me, and now that investment is paying off." He reached into his pocket and pulled out photos of the condo he had bought. "This place is yours if you want it, no strings attached. Great neighborhood, close to the park, elevator that works, everything." Ms. Reynolds' hands trembled as she looked at the photos. For a moment, longing flashed across her face before she shook her head firmly. "I can't accept this. It's too much." "You can and you should," Vin insisted. "But that's not all. I've set up appointments with the top specialists for your hip and arthritis. And there's a trust fund being created that will cover all your expenses for the rest of your life." Ms. Reynolds stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Vincent, please stop. I'm not a charity case. I have my pride." Vin had expected this reaction, but it still hurt to see the distress on her face. He took a deep breath and did something he hadn't done since he was 8 years old. He knelt in front of his teacher. "Ms. Reynolds, do you remember in 3rd grade when I couldn't read out loud because the other kids made fun of my stutter?" She nodded, her eyes softening at the memory. 3 weeks later, Vin sat in a sleek conference room in downtown Los Angeles, surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, and a small group of his famous friends who had committed to his cause. Large windows offered a view of the city skyline, but Vin's attention was focused on the documents spread across the polished table. "So it's official? The foundation exists?" he asked, pen hovering over the final signature line. His lawyer, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, nodded. "Once you sign, the Educators Legacy Foundation will be a legal entity. The initial funding from you and your friends here is enough to help hundreds of retired teachers immediately. Vin signed with a flourish, then looked around at the faces watching him. His old friend Carlos, the director. Lena, an actress who had worked her way up from community theater. Dev, a producer whose mother had been a school principal in the Bronx. Each had contributed millions to the foundation after hearing about Ms. Reynolds. Thank you all, Vin said, his voice gruff with emotion. This means more than you know. Dev leaned forward. My mom worked 60-hour weeks for 30 years, then had to move in with me because her pension barely covered groceries. This isn't charity. It's fixing something broken in how we treat the people who raise our kids. Carlos nodded. The money's the easy part. The hard part is finding these teachers. Many of them are too proud to ask for help. That's where Ms. Reynolds comes in, Vin replied, pulling out his phone to show them a photo of his former teacher in her new condo. She was sitting by the large window, sunlight illuminating her face as she smiled at the camera. She's agreed to be on our board. She has contacts with teacher organizations across the country and knows what retired educators actually need, not what we think they need. The meeting continued as they hammered out details, how teachers would apply for assistance, what kinds of help they would offer, how to ensure the foundation would last. By the time they finished, the sky outside had darkened, but Vin felt lighter than he had in years. The next morning, he flew back to New York to visit Ms. Reynolds. The change in her after just 3 weeks was remarkable. With proper medical care, her movements were less painful. The stress lines around her eyes had softened. She greeted him at the door of her new home with a hug. You've gone and changed my life completely, she said, leading him inside. Dr. Williams says my arthritis is responding well to the new medication, and having an elevator instead of those dreadful stairs, my hip hasn't felt this good in years. The condo looked lived in now. Ms. Reynolds had brought her books, her photos, her small treasures, but the space around them was bright and safe, with wide doorways that would accommodate a walker if she ever needed one. I brought coffee and bagels, Vin said, setting a bag on the kitchen counter. And updates about the foundation. As they ate, he explained what had been accomplished so far. Ms. Reynolds listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions that showed she had been thinking deeply about how to make the project work. We've already identified 38 teachers in situations similar to yours, Vin explained. People who gave everything to their students and ended up struggling in retirement. We're starting with housing and medical care, but the goal is to create a support system that gives teachers the retirement they deserve. Ms. Reynolds wiped a tear from her eye. When you were 8 years old, you once told me you wanted to be a superhero when you grew up. I think you've managed it, just not in the way either of us expected. Vin shook his head. I'm not the hero in this story. You are, you and every teacher who shapes young lives without getting proper recognition. After breakfast, Ms. Reynolds surprised him by pulling out a large map of the United States that she had pinned to her wall. Red dots mark cities across the country. What's this? Vin asked, moving closer. I've been busy too, she said with a twinkle in her eye. Each dot represents a teachers' association I've contacted. The blue sticky notes are the names of retired teachers who need immediate help. The yellow ones are teacher advocacy groups willing to partner with us. Vin stared at the map in amazement. There were dozens of blue notes, hundreds of contacts made, all by one determined retired teacher working from her new living room. I may be old, Ms. Reynolds said, mistaking his silence for doubt, but I still know how to organize. Teachers are good at that, you know. We had to manage 30 kids at once with too few supplies and too little time. Vin laughed, shaking his head in wonder. I should have known you'd take this project and run with it. You never did anything halfway. Neither did you, she replied with a smile. Now, tell me more about this idea of yours to document teachers' stories. If we're going to change how society values educators, we need to make people understand what teaching really means. As they talked, Vin realized that his initial vision, helping one teacher who had made a difference in his life, had already grown into something far bigger, something that might actually change the system itself. And Ms. Reynolds, rather than being just a recipient of help, had become the driving force behind making it happen. The student had offered a hand to his teacher, only to find she was ready to lead the way forward. For 3 months, Vin worked quietly behind the scenes, No press releases, no publicity stunts, no interviews about his new project. He wanted the foundation to have solid results before going public. In Hollywood, where everything was about image and attention, his silence made people curious. "What's Diesel up to?" became a common question at industry parties. His usual promotional patterns had changed. He turned down talk show appearances. He'd been spotted in unexpected places, visiting retirement communities, sitting in on education policy meetings, having lunch with people who looked nothing like the usual Hollywood crowd. On a cool autumn morning, Vin stood in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, watching as a small film crew set up lights and cameras. This wasn't a big-budget movie production. The equipment was minimal, the crew just 5 people, and there was only one director, Carlos, who had donated his time and talent to the project. "You ready for this?" Carlos asked, adjusting a light stand. "Once we release this, there's no going back. The quiet phase is over." Vin nodded, looking at his phone where texts from Ms. Reynolds were coming in. She was in the building next door with the other teachers who would be featured in the documentary. "They're nervous but excited," she had written. "Mr. Perez keeps checking his tie." The documentary had been Vin's idea, but it had quickly evolved beyond his original vision. What started as a simple video about Ms. Reynolds had grown into a powerful film featuring 12 teachers whose students had gone on to remarkable success in various fields. The door opened, and Ms. Reynolds entered, looking healthier and more vibrant than when he'd first found her. Behind her came the others, Mr. Perez with his perfectly straight tie, Mrs. Washington with her elegant silver braids, Mr. Chen leaning slightly on a cane, and 8 more educators who had shaped generations of students. "The green room is ready for you all," a production assistant said, leading them toward a comfortable waiting area. Vin caught Ms. Reynolds' hand as she passed. "Nervous?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "A little. I've spent my life on the other side of the classroom, not in front of cameras." "Just be yourself," he assured her. "That's all this documentary needs, the real stories of real teachers." 2 hours later, Vin sat on a simple stool facing the camera. The lights were hot, but he barely noticed. He'd been in this position countless times for movie promotions and interviews, but this felt completely different. This time, the words mattered more than his image. "I was 8 years old when I walked into Ms. Reynolds' classroom," he began, his deep voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "I was the kid who couldn't sit still, the one who talked too much, who dreamed too big for a boy from that neighborhood." He paused, looking directly into the camera lens. "What Ms. Reynolds gave me wasn't just education, she gave me permission to believe in myself. And 3 months ago, I found her living in a run-down apartment building with no working elevator, despite 42 years of teaching thousands of kids like me." The rawness in his voice surprised even him. Carlos gave him a thumbs up from behind the camera, encouraging him to continue with that emotional honesty. "This isn't just about one teacher or one former student who got lucky in Hollywood," Vin continued. "This is about a system that fails the very people who build our future. This documentary isn't asking for your pity, it's demanding your attention." The interviews with the teachers that followed were even more powerful. Mrs. Washington describing teaching during segregation and watching her students break barriers. Mr. Chen talking about staying after school for 20 years to run a science club with no budget. Mr. Perez recounting how he used his own money to buy books for students who couldn't afford them. And finally, Ms. Reynolds looking directly into the camera with quiet dignity. "We don't teach for money or recognition. We teach because every child deserves someone who believes they can be extraordinary. But believing teachers deserve to age with dignity isn't charity, it's justice." When filming wrapped late that evening, the small crew applauded. Carlos hugged Vin, whispering, "This is going to change things." Vin wasn't so sure. A documentary alone couldn't fix a broken system, but as he watched the teachers talking together, sharing stories and laughing like old friends though they just met that day, he felt something he rarely experienced in his Hollywood life, the pure satisfaction of doing something that truly mattered. The documentary was titled simply Teachers. No fancy name, no clever wordplay, just a straightforward tribute to the profession that shaped every other profession. That night, before leaving the warehouse, Vin watched the rough cut with Carlos. Seeing the teachers' stories woven together, hearing their voices, Witnessing their impact through the eyes of former students who had gone on to change the world, it was more powerful than any action movie he'd ever made. Release it tomorrow, he decided. No fancy premiere, no exclusive screening for celebrities. Just put it online where everyone can see it. Carlos looked surprised. That's not how things are usually done. Vin smiled. Nothing about this project has been usual. Let's keep it that way. The morning after the documentary was released online, Vin woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop. Bleary-eyed, he scrolled through hundreds of notifications. The film had gone viral overnight, spreading across social media platforms faster than anyone had predicted. Have you seen the numbers? Carlos texted. 5 million views already. It's everywhere. Vin's publicist called next, her voice a mix of excitement and frustration. Every news outlet wants an interview. Why didn't you tell me about this project? I could have planned a proper media strategy. But Vin knew that the raw, unpolished release was exactly what had made the documentary so powerful. It wasn't packaged as a celebrity's pet project. It was simply the truth, teachers telling their stories, without fancy editing or promotional hype. By afternoon, the Foundation's website had crashed 3 times from the traffic. Thousands of people were sharing their own stories about teachers who had changed their lives. Hashtags like #ThankATeacher and #EducatusLegacy were trending worldwide. I think we might need to hire more staff, Ms. Reynolds said when Vin visited her that evening. Her coffee table was covered with printouts of emails from teachers across the country. We've received over 2,000 applications for assistance just today. And so many people want to donate. Vin smiled as he helped her sort through the papers. I had a feeling people would care once they knew. I just didn't expect it to happen so fast. A week later, Vin stood nervously backstage at a popular talk show. This would be his first public appearance since the documentary's release, and the host had promised to focus on the Foundation rather than his latest movie. Ready, Mr. Diesel? A production assistant asked, adjusting his microphone. He nodded, taking a deep breath. As he walked on stage, the applause was deafening. But the real surprise came when he reached the interview area. Sitting beside the host wasn't just an empty chair for him. There was Ms. Reynolds too, looking both nervous and proud in a new blue dress. We thought this interview needed both of you, the host explained as Vin embraced his former teacher in surprise. What followed wasn't the usual celebrity softball questions. Instead, the host dug deep into the issues facing retired teachers, with Ms. Reynolds providing first-hand insights that no politician or education expert could match. Vin watched with pride as she spoke with passion and clarity about the challenges educators faced. Teachers aren't asking for mansions, she said at one point. We're asking for the dignity of not having to choose between medicine and food after giving 40 years to our nation's children. The audience's response was immediate. Many were openly crying. When the host announced that her network would be matching donations to the Foundation for the next 24 hours, the studio erupted in cheers. As the months passed, the ripple effects of that single documentary continued to spread. State legislators began receiving thousands of calls about teacher pension reform. Universities created special scholarship programs for education students. Other celebrities launched their own initiatives supporting teachers. On a crisp spring morning, exactly 1 year after Vin had first stumbled upon Ms. Reynolds struggling with her groceries, they sat together in Washington, D.C., waiting to testify before a congressional committee on education funding. The Foundation had helped over 15,000 retired teachers in that year, but both knew that individual charity couldn't fix a systemic problem. Nervous? Vin asked, noticing how Ms. Reynolds kept smoothing her notepad. A little, she admitted. I've spent 42 years talking to children. Talking to politicians might be harder. He squeezed her hand. Just pretend they're badly behaved third graders. You always knew how to handle those. She laughed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. You would know, wouldn't you? Before they were called in to testify, Vin's phone buzzed with a news alert. A major pension management company had just announced a new program specifically for educators, with improved benefits and financial planning services. It was the third such announcement that month from different companies, all responding to the growing public pressure. It's actually happening, Ms. Reynolds whispered, reading the news over his shoulder. Real change. As they walked into the hearing room together, the the world-famous actor and the teacher who had believed in him long before anyone else. Cameras flashed and reporters called out questions. But Vin's focus was entirely on the task ahead, making sure that what had started as one man's shock at finding his childhood teacher in poverty would end with a country that properly valued the people who shaped its future. Later that evening, after the testimony was done, they sat in the hotel restaurant celebrating with a small group of teachers from the foundation. Someone proposed a toast to Vin, but he immediately stood and redirected it. "To Ms. Reynolds," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that when you see something wrong in the world, you don't just talk about it, you pick up a pencil and start writing a new story." Ms. Reynolds smiled up at her former student, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And to the power of caring," she added quietly, "which can change everything."